Strider Hyrule. If ever there was a character that exuded a cool look, it would be this character. Looking like some sort of futuristic ninja or assassin, this character could flip, climb, and use all sorts of automated robots to help him achieve his goal of taking down Grandmaster Meo. What most don't know is that this game actually started out its life as a three-pronged project. The first being a manga about the characters themselves, the second being an arcade cabinet game featuring the main protagonist Strider Hyrule, and the third being in the NES game, all of them going under the same name, Strider. The idea for it came from Akio Sake, who had recently joined Capcom as the new head of development. He managed to secure a deal with Moto Keiko to develop the three in tandem, with Moko Keiko heading up the manga side. In order to get the project off the ground properly and iron out the world, the CEO of Capcom paid the three men to stay at the Senjaku Hilton Hotel, along with a fourth marketing executive. Planning began in earnest, with the first thing being how the protagonist would look and move. They decided on a futuristic ninja, drawing heavy inspiration from the Senjaku skyline outside the hotel that they were staying at, and in 1960s ninja shows. They spent the next few days fleshing out the rough details of the story, settling on 2048 as the time period and Hyrule as the main hero. They all returned to their respective offices afterwards, and where they would continue to meet up periodically using Yotsu and Kurikawa's background and film to write out a story, deciding to keep it more minimal and to only utilize details that they would convey the atmosphere with, while leaving the rest to the player's imagination to fill in all the gaps. Eventually, they got the first few chapters of the story done, sending that and Hyrule's design off to Miyamoto Kyoko. Each team then took this more fully fleshed out idea and started to adapt it to their own media, with the arcade game and the NES game competing a bit to see who could make the better video game. Yotsu felt that the project should heighten the world of Strider itself through the methods that each platform excelled at. To that end, the arcade version would have more of a focus on gameplay, leaving out more of the story in favor of a fast-paced action game with really good visual imagery, allowing him to more fully utilize the raw power of the platform and give him an edge in visuals. This did, however, make this game stray a bit in the story section, so much so that this version is more of an independent story rather than part of the main three initial projects. Strider the arcade game. This version, like many of the Strider games, was a side-scrolling action platforming game that used the CPS-1 board. Coming out in 1989, the player navigates Hyrule through 5 expansive stages featuring Kazeth, Siberia, Flying Battleship Balrog, the Amazon, and the Third Moon. Each one of these stages are incredibly distinct in character and difficulty, shaking up not only how you navigate, but how you approach enemies, constantly challenging the player, and like many arcade games, effectively robbing you of your allowance/paycheck before you know it. In this game, Grandmaster Meo, who controls all technology on Earth, has placed himself as the de facto ruler. He directs a regime known as the Kazakh administration from his base on the Third Moon, which is actually a satellite orbiting the planet. His small rebel group rises up to face this opposition, eventually hiring the Striders group, who specializes in espionage and assassination. The job was given to Hyrule, whom the player controls. This Strider game focused primarily on the gameplay, and had the most moves and flexibility in your approach to combat at the time. The protagonist could slide by holding the stick down and pressing the jump button. This would allow you to go under projectiles and even eliminate some of the enemies. He also had a cartwheel jump that would allow him to cover far more distance than you'd be able to cover in other games. You could also do a big jump, utilizing the increased momentum the character gets when running down a hill. This is a very challenging game, especially the last stage where gravity is reversed for most of it, and any slip can send you flying off into space. Push through though, and eventually you'll face off and take down the Grandmaster himself. Strider NES. This is the next in the core series of games and is designed much differently than the arcade game. While the previous game was more linear and used more acrobatic abilities to navigate your way through the stages, this game is more of an exploration/combat game. Think more Metroid than Ninja Gaiden. This story still involves Hyrule, who has since resigned from the Striders after having to kill his sister, who had gone mad. This isn't really explained well in the game, she's only really mentioned in passing. Her full story was actually part of the manga portion of this project. He had since left the Striders and gone to retire in Mongolia. Malik threatens to kill the Mongolians if he doesn't agree to take on the mission to kill one of his former Striders, Kane. Hyrule opts to save Kane rather than killing him. Kane then explains to Hyrule about the brainwashing machine known as the Zane Project, which had been used on his fellow Striders, including his sister. Hyrule then vows to put an end to the machine and the organization who made it. This is an interesting game. It has multiple power-ups and various tricks, which are basically like spells from Link's Adventure that Hyrule can use to navigate the world and make his way through the game. This is another very challenging game, and feels far, far different, with the movement being more restrictive than the last time, but it plays a more important part in filling in the story arc designed by the main three properties. Strider, the manga. This follows the story of the NES version of Strider and fills in a lot of the gaps in the story. Now, this was published by Kadowa Shoten in a monthly comic strip and was a serial manga that was released in the latter half of 1988, finished up just before the release of the arcade game. This was intended to complete the image of the world and all its details, being the last part in the puzzle that Capcom had so meticulously worked on up to this point. It was followed up with Strider Hyu Gaiden, a special 33-page chapter released in 1998 and detailed out Hyrule's mental state after murdering his sister and resigning from the Striders. It follows him going off after a terrorist group known as the Phantom Unit and its two leaders, the Zhang brothers, in order to rescue Dr. J. Hogan, a world-renowned scientist, a month before the main story begins. This particular chapter was not included in the main book that was eventually released in 1989, and is reportedly incredibly hard to find now. Strider, Genesis, Master System. The original coin-op would actually eventually make its way to see two ports. One to the Master System, which was by all reports pretty bad with bland colors, tons of flickering, slow jumping, and others feeling like they just had no gravity at all. However, the Genesis port was really well received, bringing us one of the closest ports we'd actually ever received to the arcade coin-op version, even getting Game of the Year from EGM. Part of the reason it was so good is because the Genesis hardware was actually really close to the CP1 hardware used on the original arcade game. Strider, Tiger Handheld. Man, you gotta love Tiger Electronics and their ability to turn almost any amazing property into a simplistic LCD-based handheld. I never even recalled this being a thing until I saw it, and then I vaguely remember owning one. I mean, what kid didn't have at least one or two of these things growing up? This was a perfectly serviceable game for a Tiger handheld game, allowing Strider to attack front and behind him. He can even jump up and latch onto the ceiling. Unlike most Tiger Electronics games I can recall, this one actually had a level system. The story is the same from the original Strider game. Obviously, since it's a Tiger Electronics game, it doesn't really tell you much of a story, and is mostly a lasting curiosity of a time where cheap handhelds were literally made of almost every IP Tiger Electronics could afford. Strider 2, Genesis. This is where things get weird, because there were actually two Strider 2 games. The 1990 one released on the Genesis was the first one. It was an action platformer developed by T-Rex and released simultaneously on the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC, and the ZX Spectrum before eventually being ported over to the Master System and Genesis. This was an unusual game in the fact that during boss battles, the Strider character, who was not Hyrule, but just known as the Warrior for the most of the game, would turn into a robot. Which sounds cool, but the moveset was so unlike the rest of the combat and so limited, it hardly fit with a Strider game. It was simply a confusing title. And there's a reason why. It was never intended to be a Strider game. The game started as TOR, Transforming Overland Robot. The idea of a character that would be able to traverse horizontally scrolling environments with ambush areas that would require the player to transform into a robot form to get through the area, both due to the higher endurance and its ability to interface with defenses that would allow the player to look again and disable off-screen threats beforehand. Why didn't we get that game? That game sounds awesome! Well, it all sort of started with some placeholder assets that they decided to use for the human sprites while they fleshed the game out further. You see, Andrew Ingram was the lead artist on Strider, and since he was attached to the game, he just threw them in as a quick stopgap. Sadly, during this time, the higher-ups got wind of the project. Yeah, you know where this is going. Why don't you make it more like Strider, they would say. And that irked the coder of the game till he just mockingly said, well, why don't you just make it a sequel? He would eventually resign due to their interference in all his projects and the other disagreements that he had with the company, and they did just that, rushing the game to market with doing just enough to make it look like Strider. Comically, the Amiga version of this game, when you had a boss fight, Strider morphs into a robot that can only move left and right and shoot in a straight line. which had to be confusing to anyone who had no idea that this game was never intended to be a Strider game. However, when it was ported to the Genesis, that was replaced. Instead of turning into a robot, Strider would activate orbs that he had been collecting along the stage that would help protect him, acting as armor during the boss fight. The game's gameplay was still very poor by all reports, and while most people liked how expansive the second game was, it was still seen as lackluster overall. This is sadly the kind of thing that many like myself often see in any business. A perfectly functional idea turned into some bastardized version of itself because of some outside interference, only for that person to be blamed later when it doesn't come out as expected because it was literally never intended to be what you made it. Yet somehow, it got greenlit to be ported over to the Master System and the Game Gear. It even almost got ported to the Lynx somehow. Strider Hairyu's cameos. After this game, the franchise's popularity began to wane quite a bit. People simply didn't care for the unofficial sequel, and most of the games had been ports of the original with very little variance in structure. It wouldn't be until Atashi Tomita brought him to the Marvel vs. Capcom series that the main protagonist would begin to regain some of his notoriety that he had been known for in the past, and interest began to surge again. He would quickly become a go-to anchor character for many players who favored a high-pressure rushdown character with high mobility. That, along with his ability to work well with most of the cast, especially characters like Ryu, would go on to see him see a huge resurgence, leading to the creation of a true sequel to the original game known as Strider 2. I know you're saying, you just covered this one earlier. Well, not really. This one came out on the PlayStation, and Capcom actually acknowledges that this one exists. This one appears to be very similar to the original game, following it fairly closely in storyline, just with a host of new abilities, like double jump, thrust jump, which allows him to dart off a wall while attacking, savage slash, which lets Hairyu attack in all directions while in the air, even has a boost now that allows him to launch homing plasma waves with each swing of the Cypher for a period of time. The controls are much tighter in this version than any other version of the game, quite honestly, and it's also significantly easier than the earlier games. This game mostly came about because of Hairyu's rise in popularity from various different guest appearances he had made in other games between the first Strider game and this one. This game had a very troubled development cycle. If you can name a problem, it likely had it. Lack of personnel, staff dropouts, heated arguments during meetings, among many other issues. Atsushi Tomita, who was the primary designer of the first 3 games in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, and the reason Hairyu was in the series to begin with, got brought in to help the beleaguered development as an assistant designer, which was commonly only done with projects that were in serious trouble. He was even pulled into the junior producer's office and warned that the project could be cancelled. He eagerly stated that the team could do it. They quickly rallied together and got a demo ready for the 1999 E3 show. Reception was lukewarm at best, and Tomita couldn't really blame anyone. The prototype wasn't really ready when they showed it, and he and his team went back and pushed hard, struggling through the development cycle that even he said at times he's forgotten most of the development. When he tries to recall it, his brain rejects him when he tries to recall. However, what they came out with for all their toil was pretty impressive, at least in my eyes. They decided to try something new to modernize this particular version of the game and make it feel familiar, but less like a copy of earlier titles, by using 3D polygonal models and movement mixed with a standard 2D platforming sensibility, giving them a rather 2.5D look overall, something not really used all that often outside of Killer Instinct Gold. That mixed with the 80s old school arcade gameplay gives it a familiar Strider feel while modernizing its looks and abilities to empower the player more. That mixed with the powers listed above makes for a rather unique gameplay experience unlike any other Strider game before it. If anything, they harken back a little too much, utilizing most of the enemies you had seen in previous versions of the game. From Tokpoo, the Gravity Generator, and Solo, these are just a few of the enemies that make a reappearance in this game. Honestly, this game holds up well today, even though it met with lukewarm reception at the time. Most finding its short length and zero punishment gameplay made the game a bit easy, and I can see that criticism given the high difficulty of earlier games in the series, and the severe punishment for failing in those. However, I feel like this one, at least in my eyes, holds up a bit better in the controls department. Playing this one, I feel a bit more in control of Hairyu. When I grab on a wall or an object, it's because I want to, something I honestly felt was missing from earlier titles at times. My biggest complaint that it's too similar in flow to other games. It even has the same downhill race into a long jump that the arcade and Genesis version of Strider had. I still find it one of the more enjoyable titles that I got to try out on this list to this point, and the one I'd recommend anyone who wants to jump into the world of Strider try. Strider 2014. This is the latest in the Strider series, again following Hyrule as he tries to once again take down the Grand Master. In this one, they had three main goals. First, create a fast and fluid game in line with the action-oriented originals. 2. Ensure the visual style adhered to the series' unique analog feature. And lastly, deliver Strider Hyrule, making sure he looks, feels, and moves as expected. They quickly discarded an HD remake of the original for a fully new game mixing Metroidvania exploration elements with high-paced action the series was known for. They spent a lot of time tweaking the speed of the game along with navigational elements to make sure it continued to feel just right all the way up to release. As a result, this one feels tighter and faster than many of the others. It hits a great blend of that NES exploration and backtracking while keeping a lot of the tighter platforming elements of its arcade counterpart. What you end up with is something that's akin to a Strider Metroidvania style game, a Stridervania if you will. It simply hits a lot of the right notes for a love letter of fans of the series, taking inspirations from the manga, the previous titles, and Marvel vs. Capcom to make it feel in every way like a modern Strider game, and it works well. This is the kind of game that just gets better and better the deeper you get into it. Having multiple different energy types for the Cypher Blade and bringing back the kunai from Strider Returns was an inspired move. It allows you to stay on the move, not only striking on the ground, but throwing out kunai to aerial targets as you rush through the stages. This kind of attention to the history of the series and its details shows that many still love this character in this series, even today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this dive into the history of Strider, covering most of the main games and a few of the cameos. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you find more of my content that you like, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notify bell, that way you don't miss when I upload content. But until next time, happy gaming!